The thing nobody believes, when I tell it, is that I nearly let her go. Not because I was frightened. Not because she was who she was. I nearly let her go because of the way she was holding it, that little silver box pressed up under her chin like a woman carrying a sleeping baby down a dark staircase, terrified of waking it. You don't challenge a woman who's holding something like that. Every instinct in your body says walk past, say nothing, let her have whatever it is. I challenged her anyway, and within 4 minutes the whole of Thornamere Palace was awake, every door sealed, and men running in the sleet with torches, and a duchess standing very still in the middle of the East Court with her hands in the air and her hair coming down, saying the same 3 words over and over. Please, not yet. I was 21 years old. I'd been on the Queen's Guard for 4 months and 11 days. That was the night I stopped being a boy in a uniform. Let me back up, because if you don't understand what that winter felt like, none of the rest of it will land properly. Queen Eleonora had died on the 2nd of February. She was 91. She'd been on that throne so long that people who were grandparents themselves couldn't remember another face on the coins. My own gran used to iron a tablecloth every Christmas because the Queen's message was on the telly and it felt disrespectful to watch it with a wrinkled cloth on the table. That's the sort of thing I mean. Not politics, not history books, just she was in the wallpaper of everybody's life. And then she wasn't. The funeral was the 14th. By the 26th, which is the night I'm telling you about, the country had gone quiet in a way I've never known before or since. The flowers at the gates had turned to brown mush. Rain had got into the cellophane on the bouquets, and the handwritten cards had bled until you couldn't read the names. Somebody had left a knitted corgi on the railings, and it had swollen up with water and gone shapeless. Every morning we'd come on duty, and there'd be more. And every morning the ones from the week before looked worse. Nobody wanted to clear them away. That was the trouble. Nobody had the heart to be the man who threw away a stranger's flowers. Thornamere isn't the big palace, the one you see on postcards. It's the old one out past the water meadows, 40 minutes from the city if the roads behave. Gray stone, 400 rooms, a river on the west side that floods twice a decade. Eleonora had loved it. She was born there. She'd asked to lie there for the 12 days before the state funeral in the Chapel Royal, with the doors open so people could file past. 400,000 people came, in February, in that weather. So Thornamere in that fortnight was not a sleepy country palace. It was a machine. Coaches on the south approach from 4 in the morning, portable toilets in the deer park, police from 6 counties, journalists in the village pub filing copy off their phones because the signal was better by the fireplace. And us, the guard, doing shifts that ran into each other until you honestly could not have told me if you'd woken me, whether it was Tuesday or Friday or my own birthday. By the 26th, all of that was gone. The coaches had stopped. The Queen had been taken to the city and buried. The crowds went home. The reporters went to the next thing. What was left at Thornamere was scaffolding to be taken down, and a chapel that still smelled of lilies going over, and about 1,100 staff and household with nothing to do but walk around a very large building where a very small old woman used to live. And us standing our posts, guarding rooms nobody was in. That's the part people don't understand about the job. Everyone thinks it's about the moment. The bearskin, the bayonet, the tourist doing something stupid, the photograph. It isn't. It's about the 11,000 hours when absolutely nothing happens and you stand there anyway, because the day you decide it's pointless is the day something happens and you're not there. Color Sergeant Doyle Marchant told me that in my first week. He'd been in 26 years, face like a wallet somebody had sat on. He said, "Reeve, your job is to be boring. Be the most boring man in England, and then be there." I've thought about that sentence every day since. The 26th, night watch, on at 10, off at 6. Sleet coming in sideways off the meadows. Not proper snow, that would have been something at least, something to look at. This was the mean stuff. Half rain, half ice, and it went into the collar and down your spine and sat there. The lamps along the east court had those old glass hoods, and the sleep made a sound on them like somebody frying onions in the next room. That's the detail I remember best. 20 years on, and I still can't stand near a frying pan without being back in that courtyard. The east court is a long rectangle. Gravel. Lamps at intervals. On one side, the long gallery with its tall windows. On the other, the East Range, which is where the household grace and favor apartments are, the sort of rooms where distant cousins and old ladies-in-waiting live out their lives with a view of the river and a boiler that clanks. At the far end, the East Arch, wrought iron gate. Beyond it, the Service Road, and then the Deer Park, and then the world. My post was the Arch. 2 hours on, 30 minutes in the warming hut, 2 hours on. I was in the second stint of the night, 20 past 1 in the morning. My feet had gone past cold, past aching, into that stage where they're just information you're receiving from a long way off. The palace behind me was black, not one window. They'd been turning lights off room by room all fortnight, closing things down, and there's something about a great house with no lights in it. It doesn't look empty. It looks like it's holding its breath. At about 1:30, a light came on. 3rd floor, East Range. Second window from the left. Just a lamp by the look of it, soft, yellowish, the kind you'd read by. I noted it and I didn't think about it. Old ladies get up in the night. That's not a security incident, that's a bladder. Then it went off again, 2 minutes, maybe 3. And then a light came on 2 windows further along, then off. Then further along again. Somebody was moving through those rooms in the dark, turning a lamp on, finding what they wanted, turning it off, moving on. And here's the thing that made the hair go up on my arms before my brain had caught up. Those rooms don't connect. Not on that floor. To go from one to the next, you have to come out into the corridor, and the corridor has its own lights, and the corridor lights never came on. Not once. Somebody was walking a black corridor in a black house at 1:30 in the morning, and they knew it well enough that they didn't need to see. I keyed my radio, kept my voice flat, because Marchant had drilled that into us too. Panic in the voice makes panic in the man who hears it. Arch to control. Movement, East Range, 3rd floor. Lamps on and off, west to east. No corridor lights. Control came back after a moment. A corporal called Yusuf Barrow, who I liked and who had a bad cold that week and sounded like it. Arch control. 3rd floor east is Lady Whitmarsh, Lady Corrin, and the Duchess of Ravenshaw, all in residence. Probably one of them can't sleep. Roger, just flagging it. Flag noted. Stay warm, Reeve. Stay warm, cheeky sod sitting in a heated room. That should have been the end of it. 9 minutes later. I know it was 9 because I looked at my watch twice. Once when the last lamp went out, and once when I heard the door. 9 minutes later, a door opened at the base of the East Range. The little door, not the grand entrance with the steps. The one at the north end, the one the gardeners use, that nobody thinks about. A woman came out. She was wearing a long dark coat over what I could see was a nightdress, pale down to her ankles. No hat. No scarf. Her hair was long and gray, and it had been pinned up at some point in the evening, and it was coming loose in the wet. She had a pair of proper walking boots on, and they hadn't been laced properly, and the laces were dragging in the gravel behind her. And she was carrying something against her chest with both arms. I couldn't see what, not at that distance, not in that light. Just the shape of it. Rectangular. About the size of a shoebox, but not as deep. And she was carrying it the way I said, up high, tucked under her chin, both forearms underneath it, leaning back very slightly the way you do with something heavier than it looks, or something you're frightened of dropping. She came down the 3 steps and onto the gravel, and she started walking towards me. Towards the arch. Now, I want to be honest about this, because I've heard the story told in other people's mouths over the years, and they always make me sound like a machine. The guard saw. The guard challenged. The guard acted. It's a tidy little sentence, and it's not what happened in my head. What happened in my head was That's an old woman in a nightdress in the sleet. She's confused. Someone should get her inside before she catches her death. That was the first thought, the genuine one, not suspicion, concern. The second thought, arriving about a second and a half behind it, was, she isn't confused. Look how she's walking. Because she wasn't shuffling. She wasn't wandering. She was walking the way you walk when you've decided something and you've been putting it off for 11 days and you finally got out of bed and put your boots on. Straight down the middle of the gravel, not looking left or right, not looking at me. And she was crying. I could see it when she got under the second lamp. Not sobbing, her face wasn't doing anything at all, but her cheeks were wet in a way the sleet couldn't explain, and she wasn't wiping them because both her arms were full. 20 feet away, she saw me properly. I watched it happen. Her step didn't break, but something in her shoulders did, and she looked at me the way you look at a locked door when you've come a long way. 15 feet. I want you to understand exactly what my body was doing at this point. My weapon was where it should be. My feet had come to the position without me telling them to. 4 months of drill will do that. You're a person right up until the moment the training takes the wheel, and then you're a set of instructions with a heartbeat. But my mind was somewhere else entirely, and my mind was saying very loudly, let her past. She's 70. She's crying. Whatever's in that box, let her go and pretend you were looking the other way. I'm not a hero. I want that on the record. I've never once been a hero. I was a boy from Dagenham who joined up because the alternative was his brother's roofing firm, and I was standing in the freezing dark wanting nothing in the world so much as to be somewhere else. 10 feet. Ma'am. My voice came out wrong, too high, I hated it. She stopped, not sharply. She just arrived at a stop the way water stops. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stay where you are. And she said, quite clearly, quite calmly, as if we were discussing the weather at a garden party. No, I don't think you are. And she started walking again. There is a procedure. There is always a procedure. You learn it before you're allowed anywhere near a live post, and you rehearse it in a barn in Surrey with a corporal shouting at you. And the whole point of it is that in the moment you don't have to think, because thinking is slow and you might think wrong. The procedure has words. I said them. I can't tell you what they sounded like coming out of my mouth because I genuinely wasn't there for it. Halt. Identify yourself. Set down what you're carrying. She didn't halt. She was 4 feet from me and still coming, and she was going to walk straight past my shoulder and out under the arch, and I had a choice that lasted maybe a fifth of a second. I stepped across. Not touching her. Never touched her. I put my body between the Duchess of Ravenshaw and the gate, and I brought the rifle across, not at her, across, the way you'd hold a plank, and I said the last words of the procedure, which are the ones you hope you never have to say. Ma'am, you will not pass this post. She walked into it. I mean that literally. She didn't stop. She came forward until her forearms met the weapon and there was nowhere else to go. And then she stood there with her chest an inch from the steel and her chin trembling and her eyes going up to my face, and for the first time she really looked at me. I'd never met her. I'd seen her at a distance at the funeral in black holding a very old man's elbow. Elspeth, Duchess of Ravenshaw, Eleanor's cousin. They'd been children together in that house. 68 years old. The papers in the weeks after would print the same photograph of her over and over from a garden party in about 1979, laughing at something out of frame. The woman in front of me looked nothing like that photograph. She looked like the last of something. Do you know who I am? She said. Not a question. She was too tired for a question mark. Yes, ma'am. Then step aside. I can't do that, ma'am. You can. Her voice cracked in the middle of it and I flinched, and I hated that I flinched. You can. You can simply turn your head. It's 4 steps and a road. Nobody would ever. Ma'am, my hands were shaking on the rifle. I could feel them and I couldn't stop them, and I remember being furious about it because Marchant would have seen. "Ma'am, please set that down." And she pulled it in tighter against her chest, and she said, in a completely different voice, small and cracked, and about 9 years old, "Please, not yet. I need to describe the box, because everything that came after turned on it. It was silver, old silver gone that soft gray-brown you get in the corners where nobody polishes, about 14 inches long, 8 wide, 5 deep. There was a lid with a lip. There was a hasp at the front, but no lock in it. And worked all over the top and sides there was a design in relief that I couldn't read in that light. I thought at first it was flowers. Later I found out it was a hawthorn tree, worked in leaves and thorns with 2 small birds in the branches. It was a reliquary, 15th century. It had been made to hold the finger bone of a saint whose name has been argued about for 600 years, and it had been in the chapel at Thornemere since before there was a Church of England to disagree about it. And it was in every inventory, every catalogue, every insurance schedule, and it was, I learned this later, in a very quiet room from a man who never once raised his voice. It was one of 11 objects in that palace classified as national heritage of the first order. You do not remove it. You do not move it to another room without a written authority signed by 2 people. And the Duchess of Ravenshaw was standing in the sleet at 1:30 in the morning with it clutched to her nightdress, 4 steps from a service road, and she was crying, and she would not put it down. That's what I was looking at. That's what I keyed my radio for. Here's what I've never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. I didn't call it in as a theft. The words for that exist. We had them. There's a code, a short one, and it means removal of protected property in progress, and every man in that building would have known what it meant the second Barrow repeated it, and every one of them would have run. I didn't say it. I keyed the radio with my thumb, and I looked at that woman, hair down, boots unlaced, 68 years old, holding a box like it was the only warm thing left in the world, and what I said was, "Control Arch. I need the duty officer at the East Arch immediately, and I need him to walk." There was a pause, 2 seconds. I could hear Barrow's cold in it. "Arch, say again." "Duty officer, East Arch, walking. No lights, no sirens, no shouting. Send marchin' if he's up." Another pause, longer. "Roger Arch, duty officer, walking." And I let go of the transmit key and I stood there and I thought, with total clarity, "Reeve, you've just ended your career." Because I'd made a judgment. A private 21, 4 months in, standing at a gate at 1 in the morning with a member of the royal household and a national treasure, and instead of raising the roof I'd made a judgment. About tone, about kindness, about what this was and wasn't. If I'd been wrong, if there'd been a car on that service road, if there'd been someone waiting, if that box had left the estate, then I'd have been the man who saw it happen and asked for people to walk. I've turned that 90 seconds over in my hands, for 20 years the way you turn a stone. She was watching me while I did it. She'd heard every word, and something in her face, I'll never forget this, something in her face went soft and terrible, and she said, "Oh, you're kind, that's much worse." I said, "Ma'am." "It would be easier," she said, "if you were cruel." We stood there in the sleet for 4 minutes. I've timed it since on a watch, standing in my own kitchen like an idiot, 4 minutes, to see how long it actually is. It's a very long time. It's long enough to have a whole conversation. It's long enough for the cold to get into a woman in a nightdress and make her start to shake. She did start to shake, not from crying, from cold. Her knuckles on that silver were white and blue, and she'd stopped being able to feel them, I think, because her grip had gone from clutching to just hooked, like something dead holds on. "Ma'am, may I put my coat on you?" "No. Ma'am, if you touch me, you will have to take it, and I'm not going to make you do that." She said it perfectly reasonably. Then, after a moment, so quietly I nearly missed it under the frying onion hiss of the lamps, "You're very young." 21, ma'am." 21. She looked at the arch behind me, at the black beyond it. She was 26 when they made her do it. Everyone forgets that. They all think of her as an old woman on a stamp, and she was 26, and she stood in a room full of men in that house. She moved her chin very slightly, back towards the black bulk of Thornamere, and not one of them asked her if she wanted it. I didn't say anything. What was I going to say? They asked me, she said. Isn't that funny? They asked me if I minded because I was the one being sent away to be married. Nobody asked her a thing. And then she said something I didn't understand for another 3 weeks, and when I did understand it, I had to go and sit down. She said, "It isn't treasure. Nobody's ever going to believe me. It isn't treasure, it's a promise, and I have 10 days left." Behind me, at the top of the East Court, I heard gravel. Not running, walking. One set of boots, unhurried, coming down the long rectangle in the sleet, and I knew that walk. I'd have known it in a crowd of thousands, and something in my chest came loose with relief. Color Sergeant Doyle Marchant, 26 years in, face like a Saturn wallet, hands empty and swinging, no torch, no weapon drawn, taking his time. He stopped 10 feet away. He looked at me, he looked at the Duchess, he looked at the silver box against her nightdress. And Marchant, who had shouted at me every day for 4 months, who had made me redo my bootlaces in front of 40 men, who I had honestly believed did not possess a soul, Marchant took off his cap. "Your Grace," he said, "it's perishing out here. Would you come inside and shout at me where it's warm?" She made a sound, half a laugh, half something else. It broke in the middle. "Doyle," she said, "they've sent me Doyle." "They have, ma'am." "You'll take it from me." "I will, ma'am," he said, "but not out here." And then, and this is the moment the story turns, and everything I thought I understood about that night went out from under me like a chair. Then, from somewhere deep inside the palace, 3 floors up and half a wing away, an alarm went off. Not our alarm, not a door alarm. The chapel alarm. Marchant's head came round like a dog's. And the Duchess of Ravenshaw, who had stood in the sleet for 4 minutes without flinching, went absolutely white and said, oh God, he's gone in after it." Hey. She hadn't been going out, I realized. Not to a car, not to a road. She'd been going away, away from something in that house, with the box, because there was somebody else awake in Thornamere Palace that night. Somebody who had waited 11 days. Somebody who had gone to the chapel to take the reliquary and found it already gone. Because she'd got there first. The alarm was still going. Lights were coming on across the whole East Range now, one after another, and I could hear doors and voices, and somewhere a woman shouting, and the sleet was coming down harder, and Color Sergeant Marchant put his cap back on his head very slowly and said, in a voice I'd never heard from him before, "Reeve, nobody comes through that gate. Nobody goes out of it, not the duty officer, not the master of the household, not me. Sarge." "Not me, Reeve." He was already turning. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And I said yes, Color Sergeant. And I did not understand at all. And I was still standing at that gate 40 minutes later when they brought the second man down the East Court in handcuffs, and I saw his face under the lamp. I knew him. Everybody in that palace knew him. They brought him down the East Court between 2 police officers, and he was not struggling, and he was not saying anything, and he had a handkerchief wrapped round his right hand with blood coming through it. Sir Gideon Ray. 31 years the Queen's private secretary. If you have ever seen a photograph of Eleonora, any photograph, opening a hospital, laying a wreath, boarding an aircraft in a headscarf, then you have seen the back of that man's head. Tall, stooped, gray, always half a step behind her left shoulder and slightly turned away, watching the crowd so she didn't have to. He'd carried her umbrella for 3 decades. He'd stood at the graveside 12 days ago with his hat over his heart. And at 1:30 in the morning, he put his fist through a display case in the Chapel Royal to get at a silver box that wasn't there. He walked past my post. He didn't look at me. Why would he? But he looked at her, at the Duchess, standing in the sleet with the reliquary still hooked in her dead white arms, and I watched two people who had known each other for 60 years have an entire conversation without a single word. She said, "Gideon." He said, "You swore to me you'd wait." And she said, "I did wait. I waited 11 days. I waited until I couldn't." And he made a sound. A short, ugly, ripped sound, and one of the police officers put a hand on his arm, gently, the way you'd steer an old man across a road, and they took him away up the court and in through the north door, and I never saw him again in my life. I stood that gate for another 2 hours. Marchant had told me nobody through it. Nobody out. Not the duty officer, not the master of the household, not him. So I stood there while the palace lit up window by window until the whole East Range was blazing, and while men I'd never seen before arrived in cars with the engines left running, and while a police sergeant came down and tried to get past me, and I said, "No, sergeant," and he swore at me, and I said, "No, sergeant," again, and he went away. 3 times somebody came to relieve me. 3 times I asked who'd sent them, and 3 times it wasn't Marchant, and 3 times I said no. I was so cold by then that when I finally moved my hands off the weapon at 4 in the morning, I couldn't unbend the fingers. They had to be worked open. Barrow did it, in the warming hut, one at a time, telling me I was an idiot, with his cold making him sound furious when he wasn't. Somebody had put a blanket round the Duchess and taken her inside long before that. 2 women from the household on either side, walking her up the court very slowly because her legs had stopped working properly. She still had the box. Nobody had taken it off her. That's the thing that struck me even then, through the cold. 11 grown men in that courtyard, and not one of them had reached out and taken it. They didn't dare, or they knew better. She stopped when she drew level with me, turned her head. "What's your name?" "Reeve, ma'am, private, ma'am." She looked at me for a while, sleet in her eyebrows. 68 years old, in a nightdress, in a courtyard at 2 in the morning, holding 600 years of silver. "Reeve," she said, "don't let them tell you that you did the wrong thing." Then they took her in. I'm going to skip the next 3 weeks, because they were the worst of my life, and they were also extremely boring, which is a combination I don't recommend. Suspended from duty within 18 hours. Not arrested. Nothing so clean. Just moved. Given a room in the West Block and told not to leave the estate and not to speak to anyone about it, and specifically in writing not to speak to Color Sergeant Marchant. The word they used was inquiry. It's a soft word. It sounds like people sitting round a table being reasonable. What it actually is 4 men in a room who have all decided something already and are waiting to see if you'll agree. There were 2 problems with me. The first was that I hadn't called it in properly. 21 years old, national heritage object in transit towards a public road, and I got on the radio and asked for the duty officer to walk. There is no code for that. There is no procedure that contains the word walk. They read the transcript back to me and asked me to explain my reasoning, and I opened my mouth and nothing came out that made any sense in that room. Because how do you say it? She was crying. She was in a nightdress. Her laces weren't done. I thought if 40 men came running with torches she would die of it. That's not reasoning. In a room like that, that's an excuse. The second problem was worse. The second problem was that a color sergeant with 26 years service had said to a private, "Nobody comes through that gate, not even me," and that private had said yes and stood there. And for 2 hours no one, not the police, not the household, not a single officer, could get in or out of the east arch of Thornamere Palace. They wanted to know what Marchant had meant. I said I didn't know. They said, "You must have wondered." I said I did wonder, sir. I wondered the entire time. They said, "And what did you conclude?" And I sat there, 21, in a chair too big for me, and I told them the truth, which was, I concluded that if a man like that gives you an order like that, in a night like that one, he has a reason, and the reason is above me, and my job is to be boring and to be there. One of them wrote that down. I remember watching the pen. On the 9th of March, they called me back in and there were 5 men instead of 4, and the 5th was Marchant. He'd been sat in a room somewhere too. I hadn't known. He looked exactly the same, which is to say he looked like he'd been up all night for 26 years. They asked him the same question. Why had he ordered a private to bar the gate against him personally? And Marchant said, and I want you to hear this the way I heard it, in a warm, quiet room that smelled of furniture polish, with a clock ticking. Because I didn't know who else was awake in that building, sir. And I've been in this service long enough to know that the most dangerous man in a crisis isn't the one who breaks in. It's the one who's already inside, who everybody trusts, who says, give it to me, I'll take care of it. I couldn't be certain I wasn't about to become that man. Neither could anyone else who came down that court. So I removed the possibility. Silence. You put that decision on a private with 4 months' service. I did, sir. Why? Because he'd already made it, Marchant said. Before I got there. He'd already looked at a Duchess and a national treasure and a service road, and instead of doing the thing that would have made him look best, he did the thing that would hurt her least, and then he stood in the sleet and paid for it. That's the only man in that courtyard I'd have trusted with the gate. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I looked at the clock and I concentrated very hard on the clock. Nobody said anything for about 10 seconds. Then the man in the middle said, Private Reeve, you'll return to duty on Monday. Color Sergeant, stay behind. And that was the inquiry. Now, the box. I have thought for 20 years about whether to tell this part, and I've decided that I will, because everyone involved is dead now except me, and because the version people tell in the pubs around Thornemere is so much uglier than the truth, and because she looked at me in a courtyard and told me not to let them say I'd done the wrong thing. So, the reliquary of Thornemere is opened once in a reign. Not for the public, not for the cameras. It is a private rite, older than the building it sits in, and it happens after the funeral and before the new sovereign's first council, and it exists for one reason. The sovereign's predecessor may leave in that box one sealed thing, a letter, a wish, a word to be read only by the one who comes next. Most of them leave nothing. The box is open, the priest looks, the box is closed. It takes 4 minutes. There are 2 witnesses and a record is made, and the record says Nile, nothing, and it's put away for 100 years. Eleonora had left something. She had put it there in the 2nd week of her reign, at 26 years old, and it had sat in that chapel for 65 years while she opened hospitals and boarded aircraft in headscarves and became the wallpaper of everybody's life. And she had known, every single day, that on the day she died a priest would open that box in front of witnesses and read it. And somewhere around 1961 she couldn't bear it anymore, and she went to the one person alive who had known her before she was anybody, her cousin, Elspeth, who was about to be married off to a man in Northumberland and sent 500 miles away from the only friend she had. And she made her swear, when I die before they open it, you take it out. You don't read it, you burn it. 11 days. That's how long Elspeth of Ravenshaw waited after the funeral, sleeping in a grace and favor room on the 3rd floor of the East Range, listening to the palace go quiet, working up to it. 10 days left before the rite. And she did it at 1:30 in the morning because that was when she finally believed nobody would stop her. And she was wrong about that. And the man who stopped her was 21 and from Dagenham and had frost in his eyebrows. Sir Gideon Ray had also known. He'd been told in 1994, when Eleonora thought she was dying and wasn't. And he had promised her too, but Gideon Ray had spent 31 years of his life managing what the world was allowed to know about that woman, standing behind her left shoulder, watching the crowd so she didn't have to, and somewhere in those years the promise had turned in him. He couldn't do it. He couldn't watch it burn. He'd meant to take it to the archive, seal it 100 years. Let it be somebody else's problem in a century when everyone who'd loved her was dust, because he could not accept that the only page in the world where she'd ever been a person instead of a monarch was going to go up a chimney because a woman in Northumberland had made a promise 65 years ago. Two people who loved her, one keeping her word, one breaking it to keep her. I've never once been able to decide which of them was right. They burned it on the 18th of March in the green sitting room at Thornemere, in the grate, with the chimney drawing badly because it hadn't been swept since before the Queen got ill. The right requires 2 witnesses. I don't know whose idea it was. I've always suspected Marchant, and he never admitted it, and he's been dead 9 years, so I'll never know now. They were Colour Sergeant Doyle Marchant and Private, by then Lance Corporal. They'd pushed it through in a fortnight, which tells you something, Ellis Reeve. I was 21. I had a haircut I'd got in the village for £4. I stood at the door with my cap under my arm. There were 5 people in that room. The Duchess, a priest so old he'd had to be helped up the stairs, 2 of us, and the new king, who did not sit down and who did not speak once from the moment he came in. She took it out of the box herself. Nobody helped her. It was a single sheet, folded in 3, and it had gone the color of weak tea at the edges. There was a wax seal on it, dark red, cracked across the middle from age. And there was handwriting on the outside, 3 or 4 words. I don't know. I was 10 feet away and I made a point of not looking, and I have kept that point for 20 years and I'm keeping it now. The old priest asked her, in a very thin voice, if she wished the contents read. And the Duchess of Ravenshaw said, no, she was 26. Nobody asked her a thing in her whole life. They're not going to start now. And she put it on the fire. It didn't burn cleanly. Old paper doesn't. It went brown from the middle out, and the seal ran, and the folds opened as the heat took them the way a hand opens, and for about a second and a half you could see writing on the inside, lines of it, close together, the way you write when you have a great deal to say and only one sheet. Nobody looked. That's the thing I'd want on my headstone if I could only have one. Nobody in that room looked. 5 people watched a fire instead. Then it was ash, and the ash went gray, and the priest said something in Latin, and the new king turned around and walked out of the room without a word, and I have never in my life seen a man's back look like that. The Duchess of Ravenshaw stopped in the doorway on her way out. She had her hand on the frame. She was steadier than she'd been in the courtyard, but not much. Lance Corporal Reeve, she said. Ma'am, you've been promoted. Yes, ma'am. Do you know why? I said no, ma'am, which was true. And she said, neither do they. They think it's because you held the gate. It isn't. She looked past me, down the corridor, at 400 rooms that a girl of 26 had walked out of once and never really come back to. It's because you asked them to walk, she said. And then she went home to Northumberland, and she died the following winter. And there was a small notice in the papers and a photograph from a garden party in 1979 where she's laughing at something out of frame. Gideon Ray resigned on the 20th, health reasons. No charges. Of course not. He'd broken a display case with his fist in a building he'd had the keys to for 31 years. There isn't a court in England that would have known what to do with it. I heard he lived another 6 years in a cottage on the estate at Thornemere, and that he walked in the Deer Park every morning regardless of weather, and that once a month or so he'd stop at the East Arch and stand there for a bit, looking at the gravel, and then go on. I was never on that post again when he did it. I've been glad and I've been sorry, roughly equally, for 2 decades. I did 22 years in the end. I never had another night like it. Not one. 22 years of standing in the cold outside rooms that nobody was in, being boring, being there, and out of all of it, one courtyard, 4 minutes, a woman in a nightdress with her laces undone. People ask me when they find out, which is rare because I don't tell it. People ask me the same question. They lean in and they lower their voices and they say, "What was in the letter?" And I say I don't know, and they don't believe me. They think I'm being discreet or noble or that I've signed something. They wink. But I really don't know. I stood 10 feet away with my cap under my arm, and I looked at a fire and not at the paper, and I couldn't tell you a single word of it if you put a gun to my head. That's what people never understand about the job. They think guarding something means keeping other people out. It doesn't. It means being the one man in the room who could look, standing where he was put, in the cold at 1:30 in the morning, and not looking.